I got this book from my college library, G.K. Chesterton's Spice of Life, and I got to the article, Fiction as Food, or it's an essay, and I got to the second part, and I'm like, I need to read this out loud. I just do. Fiction as Food. I have been asked to explain what I meant by saying, literature is a luxury, fiction is a necessity. I have no notion of when I said it, or where I said it, or even whether I said it, in the sense that I do not now remember ever having said it at all, but I do know why I said it, if I said it at all. It is the advantage of believing in what some call dogma and others call logic. Some people seem to imagine that a man being skeptical and changing his beliefs, or even a man being cynical and disregarding his beliefs, is a sort of advantage to him in liberality and flexibility of mind. The truth is exactly the other way. By the very laws of the mind, it is more difficult to remember disconnected things than connected things, and a man is much more in control of a whole range of controversy if he has connected beliefs than if he had never had anything but disconnected doubts. Therefore, I can immediately understand the sentence submitted to me, as if it were a sentence made up by somebody else, as perhaps it was. Literature is a luxury because it is part of what the popularity has called having the best of everything. Matthew Arnold would have been pained to be called popular, but he said what was really the same thing as the popular saying, that culture is knowing the best that has been said and thought. Literature is indeed one of the nobler luxuries which a well-governed state would extend to all, and even regard as necessities in the nobler sense. But it is a luxury in the plain sense that human beings can do without it and still be tolerably human, or even tolerably happy. But human beings cannot be human without some field of fancy or imagination, some vague idea of the romance of life, and even some holiday of the mind in a romance that is a refuge from life. Every healthy person at some period must feed on fiction as well as fact, because fact is a thing that the world gives to him, whereas fiction is a thing that he gives to the world. It has nothing to do with a man being able to write, or even with his being able to read. Perhaps its best period is that of childhood, what is called playing or pretending. But it is still true when the child begins to read, or sometimes, heaven help him, begin to write. Anyone who remembers a favorite fairy story will have a strong sense of the original solidity and richness and even definite detail, and will be surprised, if he rereads it in later life, to see how few and bald were the words of his own imagination that had made not only vivid, but varied. Even the errand boy who read hundreds of penny dreadfuls, or the lady who read hundreds of novels from the circulating library, were living an imaginative life that did not come wholly from without. Now nobody supposes that all those things which feed the hunger for fiction will commend themselves to the palate of literature. Literature is only that rare sort of fiction which rises to a certain standard of objective beauty and truth. When a child, almost as soon as he can speak, has invented the imaginary family of Pubbles, with father and mother and naughty child all complete, nobody supposes that the psychology of the house of Pubbles is differentiated as delicately as that of the family of Poyden, in a story by Henry James. When the lady has followed and forgotten 100 heroines and their wanderings through mysterious suburban flats or murderous country rectories, nobody supposes that each of them remains even for her as a portrait, as vivid as Elizabeth Bennet or Becky Sharp. It is not a thing like having an appreciation of a good wine. It is a thing like having an appetite for a square meal. It is not a vintage, but a viand. Now, this general need is connected with the deepest things in man, and the strangest thing about him, which is being like a man. As a large mirror will make one room look like two rooms, so the mind of a man is first a double mind, a thing of reflection and of living in two worlds at once. The caveman who is not content that reindeer should be real did something that no other animal has ever done or apparently will ever do. Of course, we cannot prove that the animal has not imagination in an inferior sense. For all we can prove, the rhinoceros may have an invisible playmate. Yet, realize with his reason that it is but a rhinoceros of air, and it lingers in the garden there. Scientifically speaking, we cannot determine that the rabbit has not an imaginary family of rabbits on the lines of Brer Rabbit, as well as the somewhat large and increasing family that a rabbit produces in the ordinary way of business. But there is such a thing as common sense, and I think that our common sense inclines us to suppose that any such artistic daydream, if it exists in beasts and birds, is much more rudimentary and stationary, and certainly has never advanced to the point of expression, even in fairy tales or penny dreadfuls. But for man, some form of this fanciful experience is essential as a mere fact of experience. If he has not that daydream all his day, he is not man, and if he is not man, there's nobody to write about, and nobody to write about him. I was a great reader of novels until I began to review them, when I naturally left off reading them. I do not mean to admit that I did them any injustice. I studied and sampled them with the purpose of being strictly fair. But I do not call that novel reading in the old enchanting sense. If I read them thoroughly, I still read them rapidly, which is quite against my instincts for the mere luxury of reading. When I was a boy and really had a new adventure story, when I was a young man and read my first few detective stories, I did not enjoy precipitation, but actually enjoyed delay. The pleasure was so intense that I was always putting it off. For it is one of the 2 or 3 big blunders in modern morality to suppose that the strongest eagerness expresses itself in extravagance. The strongest eagerness always expresses itself in thrift. That is why the French Revolution was French and not English, why the careful peasants have turned the world upside down, while careless laborers have cheerfully left it the way it was. When a child's soul is in the most starry ecstasy of greed, he desires to have his cake, not to eat it. I am English myself, and I've never managed to be thrifty about anything else. But about my early novel reading, I was as thrifty as a French peasant, and as greedy. I love to look at the mere solid bulk of a sensational novel as one looks at the solid bulk of a cheese. To open the first page, dally with the first paragraph, and then shut it again, feeling little pleasure as I had lost as yet. My favorite novelists are still those of the great 19th century novelists who give an impression of bewildering bulk and variety, Scott, or Dickens, or Thackeray. I have artistic pleasure as keen or keener. I have moral sympathy as intense or more intense with many of the later writers, with the hard-hitting Mort Juste of Stevenson's stories or the insurgent irony of Mr. Billocks. But Stevenson has one fault as a novelist, that he must be read quickly. Novels like Billocks' Mr. Burden must not only be read quickly, but fiercely. They describe a short, sharp struggle, the mood both of writer and reader, and a heroic and abnormal, like that of 2 men fighting a duel. But Scott, Thackeray, and Dickens have the mysterious trick, or talent, of the inexhaustible novel. Even when you have come to the end of the story, we somehow feel that it is endless. People say they have read Pickwick 5 times, or 50 times, or 500 times. For my part, I have only read Pickwick once. Since then, I have lived in Pickwick, walked into it, when and where I chose, as a man who walks into his club. But whenever I have walked in, it seemed to me as if I found something new. I'm not sure that stringent modern artists like Stevenson or Mr. Belloc do not actually suffer from the strictness and swiftness of their art. If a book is a book to be lived in, it should be, like a house to be lived in, a little untidy. Apart from the chaotic classics such as these, my own taste in novel reading is one which I am prepared in rather a special manner not only to declare but to defend. My taste is for the sensational novel, the detective story, the story about death, robbery, and secret societies, a taste which I share in common with the bulk of at least the male population of this world. There was a time in my own melodramatic boyhood that I became quite fastidious in this respect. I would look at the first chapter of any new novel as a final test of its merits. If there was a murdered man under the sofa in the first chapter, I read the story. If there was no murdered man under the sofa in the first chapter, I dismissed this story as a tea-table twaddle, which it often really was. But we often lose a little of that fine edge of austerity and idealism which sharpened our spiritual standard of our youth. I have come to compromise with the tea table and be less insistent about the sofa. As long as a corpse or two shows up in the second, the third, and even in the fourth or fifth chapter, I make allowance for human weakness and I ask no more. But a novel without any death in it is still to me a novel without any life in it. I admit that the very best of the tea table novels are great art. For instance, Emma or Northanger Abbey. Sheer elemental genius can make a work of art out of anything. Michelangelo might make a statue out of mud, and Jane Austen can make a novel out of tea. That much more contemptible substance. But on the whole, I think that a tale about one man killing another man is more likely to have something in it than a tale in which all the characters are talking trivialities without any of that instant or silent presence of death, which is the strong spiritual bonds of all mankind. I prefer the novel in which one person does another person to death to the novel in which all persons are feebly and vainly trying to get the others to come to life. But I have another and more important quarrel about the sensational novel. It seems to be a very general idea that the romance of the tomahawk will be, or will run the risk of being, more immoral than the romance of the teapot. This I violently deny. And this I have the support of practically all the old moral traditions of our civilization, and of every civilization. High or low, good or bad, clever or stupid. A moral story almost always meant a murderous story. For the old Greeks, a moral play was one full of madness and slaying. For the great medievals, a moral play was one which exhibited the dancing of the devil in the open jaws of hell. For the great Protestant moralists of the 17th and 18th centuries, a moral story meant a story in which a parasite was struck by lightning, or a boy was drowned for fishing on a Sunday. For more rationalistic moralists of the 18th century, such as Hogarth, Richardson, and the author of Sandford and Merton, all agreed that shocking calamities could probably be indicated as the result of evil doing, that the more shocking these calamities were, the more moral they were. It is only in our exhausted and agnostic age that the idea has been started that if one is moral, one must be melodramatic. But I believe that sensational novels are the most moral part of modern fiction, and I believe that upon two converging lines, such as make it all real conviction, it is, I think, the fact that melodramatic fiction is moral and not immoral. It is, I think, the abstract truth that any literature which represents our life as dangerous and startling is truer than any literature that presents it as dubious and languid. For life is a fight and is not a conversation.